Welcome to the fourth week of Snap Happy, for beginners photography, produced by Glairvit Productions for Hastings Digital Museum. What we're looking at this week is using a mobile telephone to take professional looking photographs. In many ways, when you are using a mobile telephone for photography and you want to try and take some decent photographs, you use most of the techniques that we've already been speaking about during the past few weeks, but there are a few things that are specific to mobile telephones that might otherwise cause you problems that you might not get with any other kind of camera. They are great, they do a fantastic job, the resolution is very good, but they do have their limitations. Over the weeks I've been talking quite a bit about the rule of thirds and how it's important to compose your photographs so you put different things in different parts of your field of view, and that you could imagine the camera being divided into thirds. How you've got the rule of three being one of the prime things that you could use for very simple composition. Some people just imagine where they are, but some people find the grid lines very useful. Most mobile telephones will have a set of grid lines on them if you want to use them. On a Samsung, you just go to settings, you just scroll down to find grid lines and turn them on. On an iPhone you go to settings and then photo and camera and turn the grid on. When you turn the grid on, it will break the thing up into 9 equal size boxes so that you can then apply the rule of thirds to any photograph that you're taking. If you remember, the rule of thirds means that you try and get the points of focus at one of those cross points, one of those 4 cross points around the middle box, to give yourself a really decent composition. Here we have a photograph of the bandstand in the park taken using the rule of thirds. The bandstand itself is sitting on the rule of thirds. It's sitting on a third line. The top of it is on the third line, and a third line also intersects more or less through the middle of the bandstand. I could have put the bandstand further up the picture, but if I'd done so I would have lost the tops of the trees and I would have lost the sky. The sky is also showing a rule of third, and at the bottom, not quite but more or less, the path on the grass is also showing a rule of third. All of these going together to make the picture more interesting. This is to remind you that a decent photograph always requires a good point of focus, something that you are making the central point of the photograph. I don't necessarily mean in the center, but the thing that you're looking at and the thing that your eye is being drawn to, and that you would use various grid lines to find your way towards it. And in this photograph there's no real point of focus. It's quite an interesting landscape. You can see the beacon, you can see the East Hill lift, you can see the sea, but there's no real point of focus. In fact, your eye tends to be drawn to the bushes in the middle, which are okay but not a particularly interesting or well composed photograph. Whereas here we definitely do have a point of focus where our eye is being drawn to that archway there. If we were to have somebody standing in that archway, that could also be a frame within a frame. And there's also a degree of symmetry within the photograph with the trees, one on each side. One of the differences between a mobile telephone and a telephone with interchangeable lenses is the zoom function. A lot of people use the zoom function to make their photograph bigger, but you need to remember that this is not a telephoto lens. What you are doing is that you are changing the magnification, but you're not changing the resolution. I'll explain what that means in a minute. So if you are using a mobile telephone to take photographs, it's not a good idea to use the zoom, because what the zoom function does is it cuts down the number of pixels in the picture, and therefore your picture can become very blurry very quickly. As I said, what we've got here is a difference between what is called magnification, which is making an image larger, and resolution, which is the ability to being able to distinguish between 2 points. When you make an image larger, you're simply making that image larger. You're not getting any more definition in the picture. In fact, the larger it gets, the less definition you get in the picture. Whereas resolution, you're actually being able to distinguish between 2 points even though they're a long way away, and that makes a big difference to the quality of the photograph that you get at the other end. It's probably easier to illustrate this point simply by showing you a couple of photographs of exactly the same thing, one of them with magnification and one of them with a telephoto lens, so you just get a complete difference in resolution. This was taken on a mobile telephone and then zoomed in as much as I could, and then once I'd zoomed it in, I then zoomed it even further on the computer. So you get this massive amount of pixelation, and it's very difficult to see what the photograph is, and unless you're trying to make something very abstract, it's not actually very useful. This was also taken on a mobile telephone, and in this circumstance what I've done is I've walked as close as I can to the subject that I am trying to photograph. I haven't used any zoom function, and you can see I've got exactly the same picture here, but with a much better resolution all round. You've got a greater clarity and sharpness of the image. One of the great advantages of a mobile telephone is, of course, that it's always with you, it's sitting in your pocket. But of course, one of the great disadvantages of the mobile telephone is exactly the same, and that is if it's sitting in your pocket, the lens of the telephone could be just picking up all sorts of things that are sitting around in your pocket. Pockets are not always necessarily the cleanest places in the world. And therefore, it's important to remember, particularly before you start taking any photographs, to clean the lens on your camera, and probably to keep it cleaned regularly. And here we have an example of the kind of thing that might happen if your lens is not kept clean. You just get a very blurry picture because there's a load of something or the other all over the lens. Likewise, rain. If you get a drop of water on the lenses on mobile telephones are very, very small, and if you get a drop of rainwater onto your lens, this is actually exactly the same photograph taken of the house at the end of the garden with a drop of water on the lens, and you can see that it's absolutely impossible to see a thing. And here we have the photograph taken with a clean lens without water all over it. But the important thing to remember here is to use natural light. The flash on mobile camera can be pretty harsh, and it's also central. It's there alongside the lens itself, and therefore it tends to be just a front fill flash, which tends to lose all shade and shadow within an image. It just makes it very blank and very stark. So in general, I would avoid using a flash on a mobile telephone if I possibly can, although I might use it as an infill in daylight. I might deliberately turn it on if I've got something that's in natural light, but it's sitting in a bit of shadow, so I might actually try to use it as a bit of infill. But in general, I would avoid using a flash on a mobile telephone unless I absolutely have to. So here we have an example of using a flash on a mobile telephone. In this case, the clock being photographed in natural daylight was still a little bit too dark, and it had some shadows on it which didn't quite work, and therefore I did use the flash on the clock, which has brought things out a lot better. But here you need to be careful because it's getting very close to getting reflections of flare from the face of the clock, and there are certainly reflections of flare from the woodwork. If I had a a separate flash, I don't think I would have necessarily flashed from that angle. I probably would have put my flash gun further over to the right just to enhance the natural light. But here is an example of using a flash as daytime infill. Mobile telephones can of course be subject to exactly the same problems of camera shake that you might have with any other camera, and there are small tripods that you can get for mobile telephones, and if you're really serious and trying to do a bit of very serious mobile telephone photography, then it might be worth considering buying yourself a tripod. Might also be worth considering buying yourself some detachable lenses, so that you can use different lenses on the telephone to maintain the resolution rather than trying to zoom in and out. So these are a couple of accessories that you can get rid of relatively cheaply. Those being a set of lenses. You probably get a set of lenses for about £25, and you might be able to get a tripod for about 15. In general, the camera on the front of the camera, the selfie camera, isn't as good, doesn't have a good resolution as the one on the back of the camera. But nevertheless, sometimes it might be worth considering using it, particularly if you're, for example, looking at something on the ceiling. You have a photograph of my ceiling. What you might want to do, I mean, say you're in an old church or something and you want to take a photograph of the ceiling. Well, you've got two possibilities. You can either lay on the floor and point the mobile telephone at the ceiling, or you could switch around to the selfie camera and then point the mobile telephone at the ceiling and use that to take the photograph. This is another possibility that you could do. The only way to really know what to do with your camera, your mobile telephone, is to have a look at it and play with the functions that are there. Different cameras, different mobile telephones will have different functions, different makes will have different things. It's impossible on a generic thing like this to try and say on this phone you do this, on that phone you do that, because there are going to be so many different kinds of things that you could do. You can find tutorials on YouTube and similar for different telephones, and of course the manufacturers are very keen for you to use their different functions, and so there's lots of information out there, but do use them. They're refining them all the time. You'll probably find a little cog or something on your telephone, or you might find something within settings. Have a look in there, see what you can find. On the bottom of the picture that you're trying to take, there's probably some kind of thing to scroll through, and you can scroll through there and it might say video function, it might say photo function, there's probably a panoramic function. There are all sorts of functions that you might be able to use. So have a look at it, play with them. It's the only way you're really going to move things forwards. Don't be afraid to play. The worst you can do is take an awful picture. Many of the more modern mobile telephones will have a focusing function where you can focus more on the subject that you're looking for. They all have an autofocus so that you get a generic focus on the entire picture, but many of them, if you were to find your point of focus and put your finger on it, you'll probably get a little circle or a little star or something underneath your finger, and what you're telling the mobile telephone to do is to focus on that spot. So you could focus on somebody's face or on somebody's eyes or on your object that you're looking at in the landscape, and you can bring the focus into that. And many of the cameras will also at that point automatically set the exposure for that thing that you're photographing. So it's certainly worth seeing if your camera does that. Most mobile telephones do have some kind of panorama function, which can be very, very useful if you're standing on top of a high building and you just want to take a panorama of what's there below you. This panorama I've done, I was actually standing on one spot, and it was just a panorama around, and of course because I started on the path on one side and then finished on the same path by the time I turned around, you get this very interesting feel that the path was going in two different directions, but it's actually the same path just going straight away along the top of the hill. but you can have a lot of fun with it. Otherwise, with a mobile telephone, it's simply a matter of remembering all those things that we've been covering before in previous weeks. The rule of thirds, golden ratio, lines, diagonals, frames within frames, symmetry, contrasting colours, negative space, and so on. Don't forget to move around. Don't just stand still. Move your feet. We've already worked out that moving your feet just a few meters can give you such a different perspective. It gives you such a different photograph. And don't forget to keep the horizon straight. If you want more detail on these, I suggest you go back and have a look at previous weeks where I'd explain these things in a lot more detail. But just to run you through the main techniques, let's say, of composition, and you can use these on a mobile telephone as much as on anything. Leading lines is just setting yourself up so that there are various lines within the environment which are pointing to the focus of your particular photograph. Diagonals on buildings and in the environment can be used also to point to your subject as another example. Have a look for frames within frames. For example, here, two houses and the net shot neatly framed between the two. It's worth just looking around to see if you can find these things to get your photograph a little bit extra perspective. Remember to use symmetry and asymmetry. See, here we have Hastings Castle with the two pieces of wall or two towers in symmetry, nicely framed within the photograph, but one's bigger than the other just to give it a little bit more interest. So let's go back and have a look at the colour triangle. If you recall that it had red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet going around the outside the triangle, and that different colours contrasted each other. And in this case we've got red and green who contrast each other, and we've got a pair of lovely red and green doors, just making some fantastic contrasting colours, and in this case also doing some symmetry. Remember to take a look for repeating patterns. Here we have a repeating pattern on a wall. That repeating pattern is also pointing to the subject of the photograph, and the subject of the photograph is also there within the rule of thirds. And although it seems to be counterintuitive, because you always want to completely fill the frame of your photograph to think that you've done something, don't forget to use negative space, where most of your photograph is actually blank, but it adds a lot of interest to the point of focus within your photograph. In this case, the point of focus being the cross, which is also sitting there on a rule of third. So I went out with the mobile telephone and deliberately didn't take my other camera with me to force me to take some photographs using the mobile telephone. Here we have a few graves in Winchelsea churchyard, and what I was trying to illustrate here is how the shadows on those graves create a point of interest. We have looked at this photograph before, but it illustrates a number of the things that we were looking at earlier. The point of focus is the arch. The lines on the photograph all point to the arch. The lines along the path, the lines along the grass pointing down towards the arch, the lines on the wall pointing to the arch. The arch forms a frame, and within that frame you can see a lit tree, you can see some other graves. You could have somebody standing in that arch if you wanted to. There's symmetry with the trees. The trees are also obeying the rule of thirds, and also you've got colour contrast with red and green opposite each other there on each side of the symmetry. So within this photograph we're actually using a lot of the different techniques, and as I said before, use at least 3 techniques to get yourself a very good photograph. And finally, just an example of why it's always useful to carry your mobile telephone with you. This was taken at the end of June, where I was out on one of my walks that I do on a daily basis as my daily exercise in COVID times, and there's a fantastic sunset from the ladies' parlour up by Hastings Castle. But I noticed that this couple were having a cuddle at the sunset, and who can blame them? It's a beautiful place, beautiful scenery, beautiful everything, a beautiful sky, the way the lines on the clouds are pointing towards the sun and pointing towards the couple, how the lines on the ground are pointing towards the couple, the lines on the horizon are pointing towards the couple, and I could just see the photograph in my mind's eye just by looking at it. I just needed to make sure that the sun wasn't so bright it was going to blur everything out, and it certainly didn't. This is a candid. The couple had absolutely no idea that I was taking their photograph, and I managed to get quite close to them. And this is not cropped in any way, absolutely no post-processing. This is straight out of the camera and just illustrates the kind of thing that you can do with a mobile telephone in your pocket. So there we are. So just to remind you of the things that you ought to do if you're using a mobile telephone. Use the grid lines if you've got them, or if you haven't got them, make sure that you imagine them. Make sure you have a point of focus for your photograph. Focus on the subject. You might need to get quite close to the subject. The lens on a mobile telephone can be quite wide angle. The reason I say this is because it's not a good idea to try and use the zoom facility, because the zoom will cut down the resolution of your photograph. Make sure that your lens is clean. Use natural light if you can, because the flash function on a mobile telephone isn't usually very good, although you could use it to do some infill if you're in a shady place with natural light. Consider using a tripod, consider using the selfie camera, and of course don't forget to use all the techniques that I've been speaking about in previous weeks. So, thank you very much. Certainly hope you've learned something and that you've enjoyed it. It's been great fun putting it all together. We've really enjoyed putting it all together for you, and I've had a fantastic time, so it's given me an opportunity to go out and take a load of photographs. Reminder of the photographic competition, a COVID summer. The idea is that we want to record what Hastings is like in this rather unusual summer with COVID-19 floating around as a record for the future. So, a reminder of the rules of the competition. The photograph should be taken in the borough of Hastings and St Leonards on a mobile telephone and should be taken straight out of the camera. You may crop them, but we don't want you to use any other photo enhancing software. This is simply to create a level playing field so that anybody can take part, no matter what kind of equipment that they have, and that nobody is disadvantaged simply because they cannot afford or don't have expensive equipment or cameras. It's also to make sure that you do actually think about what you're trying to achieve, that you do try and apply the ideas that have been given throughout these last 4 weeks to make your photograph as interesting as you can, simply by what you have set up. Please send those photographs to the museum Facebook page. The address is listed here, and if you hashtag them, hashtag HMAG photocomp, we can then make sure we have picked them all up. Please send them by the end of August the 3rd. That week is also Old Town Week, so judging will be taking place during Old Town Week, and we'll work with the Old Town Week people as well to be sure that the winning entries actually find their way widely across the town so that everybody can see them and enjoy them. And the prizes will be a set of telephoto lenses for a mobile camera, generic ones so that they can fit on any camera, and a mobile tripod. And the judging will be completed and the results out by August the 9th. Good luck with the competition. We hope that you've enjoyed it. We've certainly had a lovely time putting this together. It's been highly enjoyable just going out to take photographs to illustrate some points. We have enjoyed it a lot. If you've enjoyed it as much as we have, it's been definitely worth the journey. We'll see you again sometime. Bye.